We're just getting our speakers up front.
Makes sense.
All right, please.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the General Baker Institute. We're glad to have you in person. I'm going to put this down. I'm Carolyn Baker. I've seen some of you on Zoom, some of the ones that have turned their cameras on, and I just remember some faces. He's smiling. You must have never turned your camera on. But it's good to see you. I'm glad y'all in the space. This is the General Baker Institute. We are a nonprofit. We are named after the late General Baker, who was my father. We have 4 pillars here. Our pillars are internationalism, projects of survival, arts and culture, and political and popular education. And so we haven't, we were supposed to open at this kind of eerie right now feeling because we had semester in Detroit, 2 years ago, was it? And then right after that, the lockdown. It was like the first, or it was like the third one, but it was the first one for them to be here. And so no jinxing us today. We're going to keep pushing forward. We're going to be able to finish that. No more lockdowns. But we are here in the space, and then we locked down and we did not open really back up. So this is us opening, really having an event again 2 years later. So we ended with semester in Detroit and we begin with semester in Detroit. So welcome back. And I'm Carolyn Baker. If you have any questions, you can ask Valerie Baker, Kadisha Baker, who's up there. Richard is somewhere around here. But if you have, there he is. He's wearing our Ghetto Coffee Shop sign. The Ghetto Coffee Shop is in the middle of the building. There's a whole historical thing about the Ghetto Coffee Shop. And we have other historical facts about the building and about General Baker. We are blessed with Lonzo over there who's talking. He was a member of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers with General Baker back in the day. So that's Lonzo. You can question him and ask him a bunch of questions later. But thank you for coming, and I'll pass it to me.
All right.
Cool. Yeah, welcome everyone to our first in-person Detroiter Speak. I'm really excited to talk about labor organizing in this year's, in this semester's sessions. And today is Service Workers Unite. So we have some really exciting panelists and discussions that are gonna happen. So first off, I'm Miku. I'm a junior at the University of Michigan. I study international studies and urban studies. I did the semester in Detroit program, and now I work helping to organize this class. So thanks to Carolyn, the General Baker Institute, Valerie, Craig, David, everyone else I'm missing for helping to organize this class. And yeah, welcome to our first in-person session. So yeah, I guess a little bit about service work. So I guess one of the reasons that I, as a student, helping to facilitate this today is because I've worked in the service industry for years. I worked in informal catering, lawn service, and then formal catering for many years. So just a show of hands, how many of you out there have ever worked in the service industry? Because it's a pretty common industry, something that a lot of us get into at some point, maybe in high school, maybe in college, maybe we stick with it for a while. And you don't necessarily have to raise your hands now, but how many of you have experienced some sort of like inappropriate workplace, wage theft, like poor managers, difficulties in the workplace, all sorts of things that maybe as a youngster when you're first starting out in this industry, you don't feel empowered to speak up to your boss or your manager. And sometimes that culture can stick around for a long time. So today we'll learn a little bit about how our panelists have dealt with those issues and maybe start to build your toolbox if you continue in any workplace really, but especially in the service industry. So yeah, I just want to introduce our speakers. So here up front, we have Graham Kovich. Graham began his career in food service and hospitality in 1997. In 2012, he became a member of the Industrial Workers of the World. And since then, he has become an organizer trainer for the union, training hundreds of workers across the US and Canada. In 2017, he helped organize a workplace committee at a local restaurant, which won several improvements to wages and working conditions through direct action on the job. He's still an organizer trainer for the North American IWW and in Detroit IWW. He is co-chair of the Strategic Organizing Committee and an external organizer. Graham also runs an online media project called Restaurant Worker News. So welcome, Graham. We also have Tristan. Tristan Taylor is a 38-year-old Black revolutionary socialist who has been involved in political organizing since he was 17, when he organized in high school to defend affirmative action programs at U of M. Tristan has become involved around a number of issues, including labor and civil rights, public education, and affordable housing. For Tristan, his relationship to revolutionary politics are inspired by his experience as a working-class Black native Detroiter who spent the last several years as a service worker. He sees the interconnectedness of the different struggles of the working class and oppressed, and tries to bring those links and experiences to the different struggles he is a part of. So welcome, Tristan. And then we have Vaibhav. Vaibhav is a professor of psychiatry and behavioral neurosciences at Wayne State University School of Medicine. He's been at Wayne State University since late 2005 and has gradually become engaged in their AAUP chapter over that time. To the extent that he can be deemed a scholar, his area of academic interest in psychology and clinical neuroscience, he has had a somewhat insightful academic career in that area. However, more generally, he has a deep interest in history. He sees the study of history as a way to constructing a personal intellectual laboratory. Within it, one can aspire to gain insights about the psychology of power and power groupings. It is natural that he will have an interest in the crucial and historical role that unions have come to play in the US. Therefore, become much more interested in the way in which universities in the US are now run and represent themselves. So welcome, Vaibhav. Now that we have all of our speakers up here, I want to pose two questions. You'll have about 2 to 3 minutes each to answer each question. So we'll start with the first one, and that is, what does a union mean to you? So this can mean a lot of things. To me, union is a verb, not a noun. It's not something that's stagnant, and I'm interested in hearing what all of you have to say. So we can start with Graham and work our way this way. So yeah, what does a union mean to you?
Kick it off.
Let's do that. Yeah, I mean, my definition is pretty brief. Like Migu said, I've been an organizer trainer in the IWW, and the definition that we work off of is 2 or more workers coming together to use direct action on the job to improve wages and working conditions, and to shift the balance of power away from workers, or away from the boss and onto workers.
Yeah, I was just saying, well, there are 2 things I have to say, because I left this out of my bio. I apologize. So one of the things I should say is that I'm a founding member of Detroit Will Breathe, which was the organization that was formed in the midst of the uprising in 2020 in Detroit. The other thing I should mention is that I'm a member of Left Place, which is a revolutionary socialist organization and publication that focuses on writing and publishing worker struggles and putting forward political perspectives and theories on how to build a revolutionary movement that empowers the workers, right? And that ultimately that is aimed to shift the total control of society in the workers' hands, since we're the ones who work it anyway. And to me, unions are really useful, effective tools for the working class. They're basic organizational methods that allow us to bring our power to bear because they are collective organizations where we can move and discuss as one. But they're tools that are only as good as the people who use them. And part of the problem that we have to think about is how, unfortunately, too often, the people who are members of the unions are rarely the ones who control what the unions do. And so as part of the fight to make unions effective tools for the working class, we also have to fight against the bureaucracy of the union leadership that too often has relationships with the bosses and the bosses' parties, be them Democrats or Republicans.
Well, of the things that have been said, I would say that for me, unions represent due process and the commitment to defend individuals who you may not agree with, but whom you're committed to defending because you're committed to defending an ideal that goes beyond the individual. And I mean, as an example, if you think of, I know the ACLU is a different type of union, the American Civil Liberties Union, but the idea that they are committed to defending free speech, regardless of which pole that free speech is coming from. I think these are extremely important principles. So I think that's probably a reasonable enough answer.
Yeah, thank you so much. And so my second question is, since we're framing this whole conversation around service workers, something that many service workers learn is that the customer is always right. You always have to serve the customer, serve the boss. And so my question is the customer always right? How do you stand up to customers and the boss in the service industry?
No.
Well said.
Yeah, no, that was actually like the theme of the customer is always right is something that I see a lot in like, online groups. And the origin of that phrase is actually the customer is always right in matters of taste. So that means if the customer orders a steak with ketchup, then you just give them the ketchup. But it doesn't mean the customer is, you don't say like, oh, you're, whatever, like you don't put ketchup on a steak, you just bring them the ketchup. But that doesn't mean that the customer has the right to, violate you or, whatever. I've had a customer jab me in the side with a fork because I was with another table and they wanted lemons right away. The customer was definitely not right in that situation. I was at a union hotel a little while back and I got into it with a customer. I was trying to do my job. I was trying to enforce the company policy and the customer gave me an expired ID that was all cut up. You're not supposed to serve someone alcohol with that. I said, I'm sorry, I can't serve you. And they raised a big fit. They brought over the manager and I was brand new at this place. And so, I talked to the person who trained me. They demanded a new server. And I talked to the person who trained me. I was like, am I going to get in trouble for this? Like, they're raising a big issue about this. And she pulled me aside and she goes, you know what? F that. This is the reason that you pay union dues. If they give you a hard time, we're both going to march into HR. We're going to get the union involved. Like, absolutely no way. And, she identified as a conservative Republican, but as far as like workplace issues and, getting run over by customers or the boss or whatever, that crosses a lot of the political lines. Those are the things that bring us together as workers. And I think another thing that we're going to have to figure out, and I don't have the answers to this in any immediate sense, but tipping is a tool that employers have implemented to give customers like sort of a coercive power dynamic in the workplace. And that's something that we're going to have to figure out how to address one day, because that's what causes a lot of workers, I think, to like bow down to customers and be coerced by them is the fact that they control our incomes. But no, the customer is definitely not always right, and we definitely need to stand up to them and our employers who give them that coercive power over us.
So just to respond to what Graham said, the first thing I think is part of the solution of the customer being right and using tips to coworkers, workers, is making sure that workers, wherever they work, receive a living wage, and that we fight for that, right? Because if you have that and you don't have to work for tips, like you have a basis for like defending yourself. And I work at Avalon, and I don't work for tips, even though people give me tips. And there are different instances I could tell you where not only was the customer not right, but like I felt empowered to not only tell them that, but to even offer them the phone number to my boss to call in case they wanted to, because without having to worry at all, right? Like what was going to happen to me. And part of what like we try to do at Avalon, the coworkers, we always talk about, and I think it's really important for coworkers to have each other's backs, and making sure that like we do that and be like, look, if you got a problem, like let us know. Like you're not alone at this workplace, so let's deal with an issue together. And I think that is the most effective way to empower people to deal with like customers who are unruly. I mean, I had a customer who was like super racist to me, and he ended up getting banned from the location because he called me a thug for like trying to enforce a no smoking policy like on our patio. And you know, I won't go into Avalon because it's kind of a weird place to work. But part of the customer service training that we go through, we get to input what that training is, so that it includes how people can defend themselves against like customers, and make sure that they know there's a limit like to where they can go. And I think when people feel work in a place where they feel respected, they also just give better customer service too. But yeah.
Well, I'm very awkwardly placed to answer this question, being an employee of a university.
Tell them about the students.
So actually, I was thinking about in a university setting, who is a customer?
Yeah.
Are students customers? Because if you represent students as customers, I think that it undermines the very notion of academic settings. And so we really work in settings where there aren't any customers. It's a completely different type of situation. Perhaps a better question might be, the university setting, is administration always right? It's a totally different question. And this is something that, you know, I'll talk a little bit about in the 10 or 12 minutes that I have, where we can certainly say at Wayne State University, we have more than adequate demonstrable proof that the opposite is true. The opposite may be true at the University of Michigan as well. Well, given that we are all of like mind, I think I'm.
Yeah, thank you all so much. So now I'd like to get into the presentations. So do any of you need any visual materials, or are you good to just talk? Perfect. Yeah, so Graham, do you want to get us started off about 10 minutes, just going more into your work and beliefs and talking about service industry?
Yeah, so like Migo said, I've been working in restaurants for a quarter of a century now. So been around. A lot of the places that I've worked in are, you know, mostly like smaller, what people call like mom and shop type places. The place that I had the most success doing organizing was at a local seafood restaurant. We had about 10 to 12 employees, depending, you know, on how busy it was and whatever. But at this time, I'd been with the IWW for a little while. I've been training workers in, you know, building workplace committees, taking action on the job. And we got to a point where, you know, I felt good about the place we were at. You know, we had been building the relationships amongst each other and that sort of trust, you know, like what Tristan was talking about at his workplace. And so one of my coworkers and I said, you know what, like we should organize this place. Like, I think we can do it. And so, you know, she and I, you know, we both had union cards at that point, and we started kind of going through the steps of saying like, all right, who else can we get on board? You know, what can we do? And we had this situation that just kind of like landed in our lap. It wasn't planned ahead of time, but you know, the owner that we had, a lot of these like small business owners are kind of like petty tyrants, you know, and this guy that we were working for, he just got like really irate over the most like obscure stuff, but one of the big things was, you were not allowed to touch the thermostat. And if anybody messed with it at all, he would chew you out and you wouldn't hear the end of it. And, so a lot of people just let it be because they didn't want to deal with it. And, he would even like duct tape the thermostat closed at some point. But so we had this all staff meeting that he called, and we're all sitting there. And at one point he's like, I don't want to impose uniforms, but some of this stuff is just ridiculous. I come in here and people are wearing flannel shirts or hoodies or, baggy sweatshirts. It just doesn't look professional. And so someone goes, well, you know what? It's cold in here. And he goes, well, I'm not cold. What are you talking about? And they were like, well, you don't even work here. Like, you just come in and collect our money. And so like, all of a sudden it turned into this like really heated thing. And anytime he would speak, 3 people would clap back at him. And so eventually he just goes, well, do you want me to change it? And we're like, yeah. And he goes, well, what do you want? And someone goes, I don't know, 68? Yeah, 68, that sounds good. So he goes, okay. And so he goes over and he changed the thermostat to exactly where we wanted it. And so we're kind of like looking at each other and we're talking afterwards and people are like, that meeting was the biggest waste of time. All he did was talk about nonsense, but someone was like, you know what? He changed the thermostat though, like that was kind of cool. And another person was like, yeah, because we ganged up on him. And so someone else was like, yeah, well, let's just do that all the time then. And so that was, kind of the launching pad for a lot of other things, And like I tell that story, not because like changing the thermostat is some big win for the worker struggle, but that small little win really awakened like some consciousness in people because they realize their collective power and the fact that if we act together, we can force some sort of concession from the owner. And so we used that to start talking about like, okay, well, we got to cave on this thing. What else can we do? And so from there, we organized what's called a March on the Boss, which is where rather than, the employer calling for a meeting and going according to the employer's agenda and who the employer wants to be there, you sort of impose your own meeting on the boss. And so he came in at the end of the night and we had been talking about these deep cleaning days that we did, where we'd come in on a Sunday and we would deep clean the restaurant for 2 hours and we only got paid our tip wage, which was like $3.50 an hour. And it was only 2 hours or so. And when we talked to people, they were like, yeah, it's not that big of a deal though. Like what, we're all like $12 when we do that. And then we pushed back and said, well, yes, then he shouldn't have a problem coughing up that $12 then, right? And so he came in at the end of the night. We had like 3 of us and we got into a position where, he was sitting at the bar, kind of like where Tristan is. We had a coworker over on this side. Another person was on this side and the bartender came straight up and said, you know what, we need to talk right now. And so he wasn't expecting it. And we just said, you're going to pay us minimum wage for these cleaning days, or we're not going to show up. He pushed back a little bit. We had just the same line that we kept repeating. It's wrong, it's illegal, it's wrong, it's illegal. And eventually he caved in on that. And so we used that to propagandize our coworkers even more and saying, look, like we can win wage increases from this. And so we just kept building off of that, having meetings with workers, we signed people up, we planned small actions around grievances. And then eventually we got to a point where there was this one cook who we couldn't get him to join the union for the life of us. He wouldn't sign a card. He was always on the fence. One of the cooks walked off the job because he was disrespected by the owner. And so this cook ended up putting in like 55 to 60 hours a week. And when he got his paycheck for that time, it was cut off at exactly 40 hours each week. And so we were like, all right, so this is kind of like one of the bigger things that we're going to have to deal with. We got in touch with another IWW restaurant in New York. It was one of those diners where they're all like Broadway singers and they sing at the tables and stuff like that. We set up one of those like Google Meet, Zoom type things. We had a meeting with them and we walked through like, actions and an escalation plan. And so what we did is we circulated a petition. We demanded the specific dollar amount. We got the entire staff to sign it. We presented it to him. He gave our coworker cash for like the straight hourly, no time and a half. So then we followed back with another action on the job. We gave him 2 days to pay it up. He came in with cash the next day, and when he handed it over, the boss started crying when he gave him the money. And so, that was like really the icing on the cake because, he had disrespected so many people. He had made other people cry. We had, we really flipped the tables on our boss. So that was the kind of stuff that we did. It lasted for a couple of years. There were some shortcuts that we had taken and they eventually came back to get us at the end and things kind of fell apart in like, I don't know, I say like late 2019 maybe, but we had a really good run. And, the successes and the failures for that. We've had members, write for blogs and publications, to talk about what went right, what went wrong. We've incorporated those into our organizer trainings, and people who are involved with that campaign, we've gotten them involved with mentoring new campaigns, getting them leveled up as organizer trainers and trying to absorb that back into the union to really, really institutionalize a lot of that. So, we've tripled our capacity with organizer trainers in our local branch. We've been developing programs for training mentors who can work with campaigns from the outside. And so people who have been involved with that are implementing stuff at the national level. So we've really been focusing on a lot of member development to work on these small restaurants, because the small restaurants I feel are like really good kind of like schools for training workers in these sort of tactics, because there's a lot of like low-hanging issues that we can fight for and use those as springboards to develop more workers into organizers. So that's a lot of what we've been focusing on. And then, the Restaurant Worker News Project that I've been working on too, that started with, there was a walkout that happened at Sonic a couple of years ago. It's a burger joint. And there was a coordinated action where the workers heard that their wages were getting cut, and so they staged a walkout at 3 different Sonic locations, and it completely shut them down for this entire city and caused a lot of chaos. And that got no coverage in the press whatsoever, And to me, like, that was a super important moment, because, these little skirmishes in the workplace in our industry happen all the time, and we never really talk about them. So that's kind of another project that I've been working on, is just kind of like archive stuff like that, try to build some sort of bigger conversation and some sort of memory, because our industry has been really left out of like the mainstream labor movement, because they say the turnover is too high, or they can't collect enough dues or whatever. But these little skirmishes happen all the time, and so I think our industry is perfect for sort of a more direct action oriented model of unionizing. And I think we really saw that too with the pandemic. There was like a lot of walkouts happening. And I think if we build more of the tools that workers can get a little better organized, I think things can really progress in the food service and hospitality industry.
That's good. That was too good because I have to follow it. Okay, so that whatever. I'm gonna do 2 things. I'm gonna try to do them well. No guarantees though. I'm going to also call somebody out because in the room is a comrade from New York named Tatiana, who's a founding member of Love Voice. And I want to call her out for its most recent. People should talk to her after, because she's all the way in the back. Yeah, thank you. Because just piggybacking on Graham's thing about like these struggles not getting like publication, right? Like these struggles like and experiences not getting transmitted. Like part of the conception of Love Voice is to be a website and then daily paper. We publish probably about like 5 articles a day, where we try to like follow each and every one of these like struggles so that people can have access like to that information and can find a way to engage and give solidarity. Like right now, we actually have people on the ground in Minneapolis who are covering the huge Minneapolis teacher strike, which was the first strike of Minneapolis teachers since '79. Is that 70? So 19, that's, yeah. And we followed attentively the Starbucks unionization efforts. We have comrades who are in the healthcare industry, who in the beginning of the pandemic led the fight for PPE, for hazard pay. And the benefit of that project is that it creates, for lack of a better word, like a network of like workers in different workplaces, and also people who are in different areas of struggle, be they community members or students, who get to be a part of this collective effort to fight for power of the working class. And one of the things that I have to talk about is one of the challenges that we are facing in organizing workers, unfortunately, isn't just from the bosses, but it's from the people who say they represent us. And that is the Democratic Party, who tries to present themselves as progressive people who are in favor of the working class. and the union bureaucracy who hold power over these associations that too often are connected with management and the Democratic Party. And what that means is so often the power that we have as a working class gets like sat on, right? Gets suppressed. And it also gets diverted. So instead of spending millions of dollars or organizing workers in different unions spend millions of dollars trying to elect Democrats, right? That's a terrible waste of resources. Why? Because some people think like, whoa, in order for legislation to change, you need to have progressive people who are in office that you can work with. Now, the 30 years of austerity, the reduction of unions, the reduction of public services, the privatization of like different amenities, ought to be proof that that's a losing strategy. So the question is, why do we keep attached to this losing strategy? That's in part because we have this misconception of power. Because we think the people who have power are the elite, are the rich, are the capitalists, and the policymakers. But the truth is, and the pandemic made it crystal clear, all of a sudden, people who treated grocery store workers as shitty people who just were losers in life because they've been in a grocery store for 10 years, all of a sudden recognize how essential their service was to the functioning of like their daily substance, right? And so there's a way in which what the pandemic exposed is not only that workers are essential, but that we are essential and key to how this economy moves. That gives us power, real power, power that too often we sometimes are afraid of using, but also are coerced in different ways from not using as well. And the question is, how do we break that cycle? It's not just a question of organizing, unfortunately. It's a question of politics. It's a question of perspective. Because how many times have people said, this candidate is terrible, but I'm gonna vote for them anyway because I ain't got no other choice? The problem is that act, we duplicate that act in different iterations, especially in key moments when struggle is possible. And we don't think of ourselves as people who have to be responsible for how change happens. Because part of the history that we are taught is that great men make history, great individuals. We rarely talk about the collective power of oppressed people, but also the need for collective leadership and action. And I'll tell you, my experience is not in being able to like organize like, unions at workplaces. I don't have that experience. I do have the experience of building organization for like struggles around police brutality or housing justice. And one of the things that's really important, we have to think about this, is to build organizations that are effective, that are expressing our power. They have to be organizations that are democratic, that allow the people who are part of it to be in control of it. But they also have to have the space to have political debates and discussions too about which way to move forward, right? And they always have to have, as to me, a principle that only through collective mass action are we able to win anything. And we also have to think, for lack of a better term, strategically in how to use that power and to how to think about like who we need to like build solidarity and connections with to bring that power out. In Minneapolis, one of the struggles for the teachers is a fight for support staff, which are largely people of color who get paid, what, 29, 28? Oh, see, look, I just keep adding these numbers and I don't know why I'm trying to do that. $24,000 a year being support staff at public schools. And the other thing that they're fighting for is retention of BIPOC teachers. Now, Minneapolis is the epicenter of the struggle around police brutality. So there's a way in which it makes sense that union is taking on those struggles. That's the power of unions. They're able to, because they're associations of workers from different places, right? They could be a source, a place where we can unite our struggles. And so it's also thinking about like how to connect these different struggles together and not just see them as separate. And here's something controversial, but also to see the strategic power and limits of different sectors of the oppressed. And as strong as the Black Lives Matter movement was, the reason why it didn't make radical change is because it wasn't able to expand that struggle to workplaces, right? And get people to take political strikes around the fight for Black Lives Matter. But we have opportunities to do that. And the question is, like, how do we do that when those opportunities come up? Like the Minneapolis teacher strike is a great opportunity to make that united struggle. So for Left Voice, it's like, how do we use the publication to be able to do that and have that discussion? An article Tati actually wrote was shared by the teachers union themselves and another association, right? And that gives us a chance to engage with people. Also, trying to wrap up, but like, think of it, because maybe you're a service worker, maybe you're not. That doesn't mean that you can't be a part of the fight to build unions and the fight to build this perspective of working class collective action, right? That uniting the different struggles. And that's something that everyone here can do. And the question is, how do we think about being part of those struggles in different ways? And obviously, Left Voice is free and open to everyone to be involved with. I've worked with Graham in the past too, and worked with one of the members, Austin, who's in IWW leadership around affordable housing. So there's also ways in which we can engage together. And like, how do we do that in principle, like democratic, like collective ways that are strategic?
Carolyn, how can we adjust it real quick? We're playing with this funky new camera that's capturing the sound of the speaker and it moves. So we want to make sure we get you guys too. So we're just, Carolyn's going to do a quick move of something.
I don't know why I did that.
And so our YouTube people can see everybody better and the Zoom people too. Sorry, just quick.
No.
I got that.
All right.
Go ahead. You ready? I'm just going to see. You can start. All right.
Okay, well, I think I'm here to provide sort of a somewhat different set of ideas that complement what the other two speakers spoke of. And I think Craig probably disseminated some of the materials that I sent out. And instead of delivering remarks, I want to start with sort of getting you to think about corporations and universities. And so if I ask the question to many of you who are students at Redefine, sorry, there we go. Perfect. If I ask you what do corporations do? And I think we can come up with a set of answers that are pretty reasonable. I mean, they make things for the most part. They make money, they sell things, they're part of a global economy, they transact business, they have to operate based on principles of efficiency and economy. Who owns corporations? Well, it depends. Sometimes shareholders, sometimes a single proprietary owner. Do we have wage inequality in corporations? Well, this is well known. There is. Is it defensible? Not particularly. Is it understandable? Perhaps to some extent, because again, they operate within a certain sphere. Now, if I ask you the question, what do universities do? Well, students go there to learn, to be taught, to do research. So then how is it that salary structures in universities, salary structures of administrators have come now to resemble the salary structures that you see in corporations? Who owns universities? Well, public universities are land-grant universities. So in principle, we all own them. Do universities have shareholders? not to my knowledge. I mean, all of the constituents of a university, students, staff, faculty are all shareholders. And I think universities are responsible for the well-being of all of those constituents. So how is it that principles of efficiency have come to dominate how we think of universities now? How is it that within universities, you have come to have a bifurcation in class where you have faculty and staff on one side, and where you have administrators on the other side, and where a primary goal of administrators now is to impose efficiency from above? Who are they imposing efficiency for? Who are the shareholders that are asking them to impose efficiency? And I've tried to look for these answers, and I don't know, lots of people have written about this. There are good documentaries about it. I think I sent out a PDF of an article that was written in Newsweek. The person who wrote that article actually is an extremely insightful documentary about it. And the question is, when did universities in the US, because I suspect this is primarily an American-based phenomenon. I have a colleague here from Europe, and I think you can attest to the fact that this is not a phenomenon that dominates universities in Europe. So when did universities in the US diverge from their primary mission, which came from a classical idea where young people go to learn, to meet other young people, to learn from people whom we call professors, we call faculty, who have had greater experiences in their life? When did it go from that ideal to the ideal of it being a proto-corporation, where again, the primary goals of administrators are primarily to implement efficiency and austerity from above, not for administrators, but for faculty and staff? And so actually there's good data. The answer to that question, when did that divergence happen? I don't know. And if other people know about it, I don't know what the answer is. But there is actually good data that is repeatedly published in publications like the Chronicle of Higher Education and so on, which show the year-on-year percent change in faculty and staff remuneration and the year-on-year percent change in administrator remuneration. And it's actually a scandal. I would suggest that for those of you, it's easy to find this information. It's scandalous. I mean, if I asked you to guess, you would probably say that the difference is probably something like 2 to 1. The difference is probably more like 10 to 1. That is, if you look at the year-on-year percentage increase in administrative budgets in universities, administrator budgets in universities, you're looking at about 30%, I think, roughly speaking. If you look at year-on-year changes in faculty and staff salaries, some universities have not had any changes at all. At Wayne State, I think we look at about 2.5% to 3% a year, if even. And so the question is, what can be done about this, and how do you intervene? And so this is something that many of us at Wayne State have thought about for a long time. And by way of anecdotal example, it's only over the last 6 months that many of these issues came to a head in the School of Medicine, where I am and my colleague Autumn Music is in. So by way of context, the faculty and staff at Wayne State operate with the administration under what is called a collective bargaining agreement, which is reached at every N years, usually 3 to 4 years. The last collective bargaining agreement that Wayne State University had before 2021 was, for some reason, 8 years ago. And if there are good reasons for why it took so long to come up with a new one, I don't know what they are. And so the whole idea behind a collective bargaining agreement is that representatives of the university administration and representatives of the union at the university meet. And of course, they transact demands of each other, and they come up with an agreement. And that's why it's called collective bargaining. And this agreement is accepted as, while not being legally binding, is ethically binding, which means that both parties operate under this agreement over the years that the agreement is made for. Which doesn't mean that after I, as a professor, have been part of collective bargaining, I go to administration and say, hey, the CBA only allows me 3%, but I want 20% next year. It doesn't work that way. because I willfully agreed to be part of the collective bargaining agreement. Our union has been very active at Wayne State in defending faculty and staff rights. And so it makes perfect sense that this is how we would go. Now, on the flip side, it also means that as an administrator, 2 months after a collective bargaining agreement has been signed, you cannot go to the union and say that because we have fiscal problems, which we don't know of, whether they're true or not, because we have fiscal problems, we now are going to redefine the terms of your employment, okay, from a 12-month employment to a 9-month employment, okay? And so when this proposal was put forth by the former dean of Wayne State School of Medicine, it was actually represented as changing the terms of tenure. That is, it was not represented as a salary reduction. Why? Because obviously for reasons of language, you cannot impose salary reductions on your employees, but you can actually call it a change in the term of employment, which is effectively a salary reduction, and then use that as a backdoor to impose austerity on faculty and staff. And I think very quickly, this actually became a lightning rod, one of the many, but this actually became the proverbial straw that really broke the union's patience. And I think a series of events ensued where there were multiple events that were organized by the union for the faculty, where these issues were laid out there as they were. There was a lot of this organization had to happen online because it happened late in the fall, early this year. The latest COVID wave was peaking. It involved the union actually putting out an anonymized survey, a morale survey, to the School of Medicine. Okay. And in probably one of the rare instances where this kind of organizing at a university had a substantial influence. 2 weeks ago, actually, the dean of the School of Medicine was actually removed from his post by the president, which I think, and Otto would agree, it's a pretty remarkable event. It was not the actions of the union itself that were able to forestall these attempts at forced austerity and forced efficiency on the faculty. Because as Tristan talked about power, but when you talk about groupings, you have to think not just in terms of power, but primarily in terms of influence, because influence and power are two different things. And generally speaking, in my understanding, unions have influence, but they don't particularly have power within organized settings like universities. I mean, you have the power to go on strikes. The question is how effective those are. But unions have enormous influence, and unions have influence because they represent large groupings of people. And so the fact that the union at Wayne State was able to commission a survey, which had, it's kind of like a democratic process. It's not voting, but it's a kind of voting. And because the union was able to engage a pretty large turnout from faculty and staff in the School of Medicine, and because several individuals in the union engaged in extempore interactions with individuals at the university who actually have both influence and power, we were actually able to change the dynamic. And I think the fact that you had a collective voice from the union that very clearly indicated that the actions of this dean would not stand, the fact that as many as 75% of, I think the exact number is 74.9% of respondents.
Just 2 minutes if you could.
Yeah, indicated that they would want the dean to be removed, that they would support the removal of the dean. The fact that many of the other actions by the med school administration made the tenure of the dean untenable, actually. I think many of these contributed or influenced the chain of events. And so I think universities are in a difficult place, and they are going to become, or they're going to be in more and more of a difficult place. And I think that this is a systemic problem around the country, and I don't see any straightforward solution to this. I think all of the solutions have to be microscopic in nature. That is, it will, whatever institution that you are at, you have to try and understand and analyze what the sources of influence and power are, and to try and work whatever levers are available to you to try and make change. So let's just stop there.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we've seen a lot of reflections on what unions, power building, that kind of thing looks like from a more organized and higher perspective of a university, to things of direct action in the workplace and everything in between. So I'd like to open up the conversation a little bit more into more of a discussion format, and also people can start thinking of questions, but also I'm recognizing that in a university setting, you see professors are already in the union, they're well organized, they have influence over students. And I'm wondering how we can apply some of those techniques and also like those power structures, because from a student perspective, I feel as though like teachers have power over students, and then administration has power over teachers, and then administration has power over students. So how do we broaden that base of support, working with students, and maybe even like what would the unionization of students and the general public, because when I'm looking at power structures, such as in a corporation, you see a couple of rich people at the top and a whole lot of workers at the bottom. Or in a restaurant, you see one boss that comes in at the end of the day, and you see all these workers. So how can we apply these techniques to a larger audience, and then also mobilize that power as a union to other issues like what Tristan was talking about, to other political issues? You know, labor unions can just be the beginning, but how do we create a culture of unions, a culture of working together in community with others? So you can start there, or reflections that you had as you were listening to each other. And you can go in any direction, but yeah.
No, we'll keep it. We'll keep the phone. Is that okay with you?
Sure. Did you want to start? I'm still thinking about the answer. That's kind of a big question.
Sure. I'll start. I'll take the bullet. Well, there are a couple of things I have to say to that. And first, it was great hearing the story about like getting ready with the dean, and really appreciate your perspective and questions about like, you know, what is a university. I'm gonna start off with two quotes from Frederick Douglass. The first quote is that the limits of tyrants are prescribed by those whom they oppress, and that slave masters are only masters insofar as they have slaves. Because this is part of the problem I just want to bring up, that we have to challenge, or that we have to think about it, and it's like how to effectively identify our power. And how do we, because here's the problem. Too often we give our power away to structures, institutions, the bosses who say they have power, and they do to an extent, right? Like the university administration has power, your boss has power, but they don't have complete power, right? Like the dynamics of forces aren't just etched in stone. And how do we think about it in those terms? Because ultimately, if we are going to see a society that treats us fairly and equally and allows us to develop our full selves, I'm sorry, but it is going to be a society where the people in power, the capitalists who like, you know, maintain exploitation because that's what maintain profits, have to be taken out of the equation and no longer are able to have power. And for me, this is why I became a revolutionary, because I understood so long as capitalism stood. You know, I'm from Detroit. General Baker is part of the history that I know. I've seen people struggle hard give their lives and blood and sweat, all for the things that they fought for in 25 years to be taken away. Every public school that I went to in Detroit is closed. Public education, by the way, including universities, can be tied to the struggle of freedom. Literally, when Black people were freed by the end of the Civil War and radical Reconstruction began, the first thing Black people did was make sure that we could read. And the second thing we did is fight for books and texts that weren't racist, to teach us about ourselves and how to read. This is why Southern states that have Black legislators enshrined public education as a constitutional right that had autonomy, so that communities could have control over what they were being taught as well. So I just put that out there to say we have to think in those stark terms. Otherwise, what we end up doing is participating in the seesaw of injustice, where we get a concession or two that may last for 10 years, that may last for 15 years. How do we think about power and how do we think about taking power? Yes, power is unequal. Every situation, we don't always have power, but how do we, when we find those moments where people are not only able to collectively organize themselves, but where the bosses, where the capitalists are weak because of objective situations, we can use that to our full advantage. And that's the perspective of socialism. It's that concept, and it's not an edge to something. It's dialectical, it's dynamic. But the concept, the basic concept, is a society ruled by workers, where we have a planned economy. So instead of, because here's the crazy thing that I always think about: economic crises oftentimes are the byproduct of overproduction, right? You have too many houses. Actually, you have all these houses, in 2008, just think about the foreclosure crisis. And they were like, oh, these houses are too cheap because they're too accessible. That's foreclosed on them. In Detroit, they made bulldozing thousands of houses. And then once that's done, to make it scarce again, that's how we can recover the prices of housing. Those things should be a basic right. How do we think about how to fight for that and fight for that permanently? I know that's really hard to think about, especially because we're talking about capitalism. An institution has survived over 250 years. I get it. Slavery survived for a couple of hundred years until it didn't. And we see, and I'm sorry to bring these big politics, and I'm gonna shut up, into perspective, but who isn't thinking about Ukraine, right? And the global implications of what that struggle means to the stability of life as we know it. Capitalism has shown through the centuries, right? 100 years. I didn't graduate from college. I've just been out there. But anyway, its capacity to be insane and destructive. So we have to think about, and not just from a localized, individualized perspective, we have to think about collectively how we change that equation and stop the insanity. And that includes recognizing in moments where we can shift the balance of forces to really capture that. That's what the organizing that I did in 2020 in Detroit was focused on. And there were some things that we were able to move around and affect and share the light on. And we're still around Detroit Will Breathe to being able to organize more stuff for when the next time there's an opportunity to express itself. But I think that's part of how do we get organized amongst ourselves, right? To have this discussion further, bringing all of our experiences, all of our questions, all of the doubts that we have, and hash them out. And I think that's because that's key and important. That's really the only way we get the answer. No one has the answer, by the way. That's something that we have to create through our experiences. But that's what a revolutionary perspective is understanding that like only through practice are we going to be able to solve that. And that practice is class struggle. So, you know, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I've never been to a university either, so it's hard for me to talk about, like I said, I've been working in restaurants since '97. That is like all I know. So like all my politics have just been through work and, you know, unionizing and stuff like that. So, but I still think though, like what was said, there's still like a similar, we're all operating under capitalism, right? So like maybe those power dynamics like manifest themselves like somewhat differently, but it's still, you know, it's still workers, it's still bosses, and there's still the, you know, the little minutia that they tie in there to keep that system in place. And that's what we're all up against. And I think, you know, we've talked about, you know, not only our class enemies, our bosses, but like the political parties and a lot of times like the union bosses too. And so part of reclaiming our power is organizing in a way where it doesn't get usurped by union bosses and by these labor relations specialists. You know, I think one of the things that really like gets me, you know, like just riled up and perturbed or whatever is, you know, we think about like, you know, this is nothing against the UAW, but like the UAW is like kind of dominates how we talk about a lot of labor history in Detroit, at least in my perspective. But what we never talk about is just like 4 days ago was the anniversary of the end of the Woolworth strike. And that was when, this was in the 30s, 150 waitresses in the biggest department store seized control of a department store in Detroit and completely took it over and ran it themselves. That wasn't part of, you know, it wasn't part of the sort of like tailorized like labor relations system where where you file for an election and then you sign a contract and you say, oh, by the way, once this contract expires, we're going on strike. They just went on strike. Someone blew a whistle and they locked all the management out and they took over the building, right? And they won all of their demands out of that. You know, and this was before like a lot of people even had voting rights, but you had waitresses taking over a restaurant. They said, taking over Woolworths in today's terms would be like taking over Walmart, Starbucks, and McDonald's all at once. That was the size and the scope of this. And one of the things that they won, among other things, was they won a hiring call. And so they took away the hiring power of bosses in the entire city. And so no employer could hire restaurant workers without going to the union first. And what would happen is an employer would go to the union and say, I'm doing a banquet. I want 15, 20-year-old white girls. And the union would come back and say, you know what? Here's a mixed race group of people, a mixed age group of people. This is what you're getting, or you get nothing at all. And they used that power to help integrate the restaurants in Detroit. But all we ever talk about is the sit-down strike. Not that wasn't a monumental event, but there's been all of these other struggles that have happened too. And Woolworths was also the stage of other fights 22 years later. Woolworths was where the lunch counter sit-ins happened to desegregate restaurants, you know? And so I think like, you know, that's one of the big things is that we have to think about ways to struggle outside of these, you know, outside of these contract fights. Like if you ever go to like the Jane McCavally trainings, she's always like, well, we're getting ready for a contract fight. We need a super majority turnout because we want to go on strike. But if you look at like the content of that, the strike is happening when the contract expires. So we're already telegraphing to the bosses that it's happening. And supermajority strikes guarantee job security for the union bureaucrats. So it shows the influence that the bureaucracy has over the way that we organize, because we think it's this big thing, but really it's just professional development for union staff. You know, we have to think about how we build power outside of that system, how we regain control over the labor movement, and start dictating struggles on our own terms. And sometimes that can start with, you know, with smaller fights over smaller issues. But doing that on our own terms, we decide who's in our organization. It's not decided by who our employers or the National Labor Relations Board says is in our union or in our organization. We form our organizations and our struggles on our own terms. And so I think part of like reclaiming our power is erasing those boundaries and those lines that have been set up by the system and reclaiming those for ourselves.
Let me address one of the narrow points that you raised, that is, what can students do? And I think the way I think of it, students, like preponderance of you are undergraduates, yes. I think are in a difficult position because for most of you, you're parachuted into an institution. You spend anywhere between 3 to 4 years there, then you're parachuted out, or you parachute yourself out. And so the only long-term relationships that you build with the institution are when the alumni office sends you flyers, which you'll definitely be getting when you graduate, to give more money, right, or come back for homecoming and so on. But the thing that I would say is that to the extent that it's possible, given all the other pressures of academic life, I think it makes a lot of sense to try and understand how influence and power flows in your institution. That is, what are the sources? What are the pressures that faculty and staff operate under? And I don't want to give the impression that faculty are anywhere near like what oppressed workers are. I think my colleagues will agree, to be an academic is to have one of the more privileged lifestyles on the planet. And you basically are an employee who are allowed to do something that you really enjoy doing. But I would say that students can do a lot to inform themselves, to organize. You asked, I think one of the questions that you asked was, can faculty and students, how can they work together? I think that was one of the implicit questions you asked. And actually this was raised in the medical school and at Wayne State University when we were going through a lot of these motions for coming up with the town hall for faculty and so on. How do you get students involved? And I think the consensus opinion was that students have to be left to their own devices because they cannot be made as, for lack of a better word, pawns in the challenges that faculty and staff are dealing with. Faculty and staff have issues which have to be separate from what student issues might be. But if students become knowledgeable about what is going on at their university, what shortcomings exist, where are undue pressures being applied, where is inequity being applied, I think students, and this gets back to what we talked about at the very beginning, are students customers? Well, from the perspective of administrators, I can tell you that you are seen as customers. I might be wrong, but you are seen as paying customers. And I think university, and this is where much of your influence can lie, by actually trying to make an impact, by trying to influence the administration, by organizing from a perspective that they see you from. That is, you have influence because you are going to be future alumni. You are going to be future donors to the university. And again, it's hard for you at your age and your stage of life to look 15, 20 years down the line. But in this day and age of information availability, I think there's an enormous amount that you can educate yourself about, even though administration makes enormous efforts to obfuscate reality and to prevent you from seeing reality. But actually, I have one perspective on what happened at Wayne State, but my colleague, Auto Music, shares some of my perspectives. I don't know, Auto, if you want to say something about it.
Basically, I followed the discussion and it's very interesting because it's it's fine. I can just speak up. Basically, you always address the same thing, that when a large group of people comes together, there will always be people. There is a separation of work. Some people are going to do the work. Some people are going to administer the work. Then it's unavoidable. Like in the university, some people gonna collect the tuition, some are gonna teach. So this problem which you have, it's always going to be present, and that's why I'm coming back to what Vibo said at the beginning, that the role of the union say, yeah, this always will happen. There will be two opposite groups, and we have to have due process, and the union is here to guard due process. And that's really kind of to you that you, for example, say, oh, we don't want to associate with, the people who did this for a living, in the thing. There are always going to be people who actually work on that because you cannot do everything. You have to work in your coffee shop. So some people are going to do things. So you have to somehow live with these people and guard and reason with them that this balance or that due process, whatever due process you understand is going to be guarded. So that's basically what we struggle with too. So that's kind of my 2 cents to this.
Sure, yeah, thank you all. So do you guys want to say anything out here, or are there any questions out here or on Zoom or YouTube or anything? Yeah.
Use the mics. If you have questions, come up to the mic so we can hear you on the camera can capture you, please. Thank you.
My first one was just a question.
It's not on. Is it on?
Oh,
Is a little switch on the mic?
it's in the middle.
Now it's on. Right, there you go.
Hello?
Yep.
Sorry, this one was just a comment. You guys mentioned you didn't study like unionization stuff in school, but like this is literally us studying unionization stuff in school and paying thousands of dollars to learn, you know? So I just wanted to say you guys are experts. That's all.
Oh, thank you so much.
Lay it out. Come on, questions, comments, anybody, come on, let's do this. Let's do it.
Hey, just go ahead, go up to the mic.
Hi, it's kind of open-ended, but I guess I was just wondering your opinions on worker-owned and kind of like cooperative employment settings and just kind of like, especially in the cases of like student workers, like alternatives to unions and other things like that, that may not be like at the surface of like typical understanding of labor organizing and just kind of like, yeah, beyond unions.
I'll take a stab at that and I'll be super quick. The first thing I do want to say this, that as much as the big unions bureaucracy hold things back, we can't neglect organizing and transforming those organizations because they literally include millions of people like who are organized. And so I think we also have to think about not just like how to be like dialectical and build organizations and independent institutions when we have to, but also how to take over the ones that are ours. And I just wanted to follow up around the question of co-ops because Buff Voice has a sister group in Argentina called the PTS that is part of 2 worker-owned co-ops. One is called Zanan, and the other is called Madigan. And they took over the factories as a consequence of the 2001 crisis that swept Latin America, right? And those were instances and opportunities where workers, could fight against the bosses trying to abandon the factory and take over and run it. And so when those opportunities present themselves, we should definitely take it. But also the experience of the sister group in Argentina shows both the strengths and weaknesses and limitations of that model of worker cooperative, because it first takes a lot to run it, right? And when you're a worker cooperative in the sea of capitalism, like it's just hard. And there's a reason why there's not a lot of them. And so that cannot be the alternative. And I think oftentimes it's presented that way because it's kind of pragmatic, because people are like, well, capitalism can never be over. We'll just have to itch it as much as possible and create institutions inside this, inside of capitalism. And yes, when we have the opportunities, but we have to recognize how they're limited and how they're constantly under attack, which is why in the end, the question of power and taking power always has to be the central one that we're dealing with, so.
Can I ask you one question? Basically, so
We got a couple back here. Yeah, sorry, yeah.
And then the other,
It like echoes.
Speak, don't worry about the echo, just speak into it. It picks up to the camera.
I'm Tatiana. Thanks so much for the panel, and I'm really super honored to like be here, read a lot about drum, and we're excited to be here. I just wanted to make a quick comment about the university and also a little bit about this discussion about co-ops. But one thing I wanted to say about the university, and also I'm an adjunct at CUNY in New York City. And basically CUNY has been over the past 3 decades increasing adjunct labor, like super low wage adjunct labor, in order to make the university more precarious, because we serve the working class of New York City, Black and brown kids in New York City, and adjuncts get paid very, very little. And CUNY is also like a place that had a really combative student movement. Folks who like took over the university, folks who were demanding, Black studies and Puerto Rican studies in the like 60s and 70s. And I think that in a lot of ways, like we've lost that combative student movement in the US. Universities have obviously become like businesses, right? They like with massive investments in apartheid Israel and fossil fuels and whatever. And I think it's super important to like remember that combative history of the student movement and to like work to bring it back. I used to live in Brazil, and there are student unions, and we actually took over the university. We like barricaded the wall, like we had, and what we tried to do was open the university to the community, because university shouldn't be these like elitist things for just people who can pay for it. It should be, in the service of the community. The knowledge in the university should be in the service of the working class and oppressed. So I want to say that. And then the other thing I wanted to say was just a quick thing about co-ops, because like Tristan was saying, we have comrades in Argentina who were involved in, and they were in the leadership of the union when we took over those factories. And those comrades were involved in organizing those factories for like 10 years, right? And they won leadership with the union, and one of the fights that helped strengthen them to be able to take over that factory was that they had a trans coworker who came out as trans, and she wasn't allowed to use the women's bathroom. The manager wouldn't let her. And our comrades who were in the leadership of the union really had a lot of discussions with the workers. And we're like, no, like we can't let this happen. This is not okay. And they actually went on strike for this trans woman to be able to use the bathroom. And like a year and a half later, they were able to take over the whole factory and put it under worker control. And so to me, that's like shows how, these struggles against oppression can really strengthen. They're not a weakness for the working class. They strengthen us to be able to take on the bosses. But the last thing, and I'm really sorry I'm going on and on, I'm done. But the last thing I wanted to say about that is that, I went to visit, I was super lucky, I got to go see them. And one of the workers said to me, this is under worker control, but only kinda. This is actually under capitalist control, because the capitalists still run this whole thing. And so that's why I think what Tristan is saying about socialism and revolution is really important, because unions are a tool of the working class, and we need them, and fucking Jeff Bezos hates them, and like, we need to organize unions. But that's not the end goal, because even with the union, even with the society, even with the union that takes over a factory, like you're still working against capitalism. So that's it.
All right. Yeah.
and then Johnson.
I'm gonna see if any other folks out there had a question that hasn't spoken yet. Yeah, go ahead, please, or a comment. Yeah, question or comment, either one.
Okay, hello. Okay. I was gonna say too, like what you guys were talking about, I don't remember what I was gonna say now, but, recently, my housemates and I were talking about REI, and they're going on strike, like different stores because of union busting. And I was saying to my roommate, it's like so bullshit that they call themselves a co-op. That's brought this up, the co-op discussion. It's a co-op for the customers, because we get to pay in, and we get shareholder returns on whatever we buy, like these. And it's just, it's bullshit. And I remember one of the past weeks, we were talking about militancy, and it's like union militancy, and gosh, I can't remember who was talking about it, but like just pushing strikes and pushing and pushing and pushing, and not being like, well, if you guys want to do this, then we'll get this. And I just I'm glad that I'm hearing this stuff, because it's like everything feels, no, not that. It's hard not to get jaded, but you can't get jaded. And it's like hard, you have to balance, we have to look after ourselves and each other. Like, especially I live in a cooperative house in Ann Arbor, so like that's definitely a principle of it. And we could stand to be more intentional, political. So in my tenure as co-president, I'm gonna work on that. Anyways, but yeah, I think it's been really nice and cool and groovy to hear all this shit about like, let's go. And to take intentional steps is gonna be great. And it's like, there's this balance of like, everything is on fire and everything's super shitty. And also like, we gotta just like go and not be not militant and not be not combative, because you can't just sit and kiss Jeff Bezos's ass. And that's it.
Right. Yeah, thank you. And
Does one work?
oh yeah.
That works. It may not project here, but we're hearing it on YouTube, so yeah, go ahead.
That's fine. I had a question more about the unionization and education and the idea of like a university as a corporation. So at University of Michigan in the past 2 years, our LEOs and GEOs have gone on strike, lecturers and graduate students. Right now, there's a movement on campus to move the wage for campus workers to $15 an hour. And there have been discussions about the creation of a student union. You kind of talked about not being able to like bring students into the fight for teachers. How do you make it a collaborative fight where we're all fighting for a better workplace than fighting against the people? If we're all the employees, why are we working together?
Well, I think there are confluences, or there are points of intersection between student interests and faculty interests. But there are also points of divergence. And I think that you have to pick, and I realize I'm speaking a little bit vaguely here, but you could probably find common ground over points of confluence, but you probably have different issues that are front and center for students and that you have to organize around. This is my opinion. But actually, thinking of the university as a corporation, it's kind of interesting how things went down at the University of Michigan with your former president, who actually, as I understood the situation, and you guys probably know this better, many of the stakeholders who could have removed him wanted to remove him for a while, but they didn't have a gotcha to remove him. And so, some kind soul got into his email and was able to leak emails, which I read them, didn't even appear to be particularly compromising, but they seem more embarrassing than compromising. But it's kind of interesting, but the lesson that was reinforced for me from that example was that in large part, like corporate CEOs, for whom actually there is much more accountability. It seems to me that university CEOs, and we can kind of call presidents that, CEOs without, even though they don't generate profit, or it seems that they cannot be removed for not doing their job well. And that there have to be other extenuating circumstances that have to come into the mix, whether it's a hint of a sexual scandal or a hint of some impropriety, which can kind of be rinsed through the legalese of the university to make sure that, you know, the trustees or the board of governors have enough legal defenses. And so I think that in a sense, this system has become corrupted. I use the word corruption loosely, where I think CEOs at universities understand that, and they understand that they have carte blanche, and that they understand that they have fixed contracts, which again can only be abrogated under very, very peculiar conditions, which are generally easy to avoid. So I know you didn't ask that question, but just given that I guess you're at the University of Michigan, I was just thinking of that.
So I just wanted to respond quickly because here are two things. And here's a crazy concept. But part of what I feel like we always have to think about, especially if we're trying to change the dynamics of power, is when opportunities present themselves to do that and how. So let's tie in the factors that you said about a movement on campus fighting for campus workers who are mostly people of color, right? I've been at the University of Michigan organizing many years, haven't done it in a while, but it's always the same. The Black students are not in the classroom, but they certainly are working, or the immigrant students, and, you know, they're like the immigrant folks, they're like in the cafeteria, but they're not in the classroom, right? How to like use that as an opportunity to not only organize solidarity, but organize the conception that the people who make the university function take control of it, have say over it, right? And so for me, the fight to organize a student union, which I think is like a really good idea, can actually benefit from the fight to not only get these workers pay increases, but also the fight of GEO and the lecturers unions fighting for better contracts. The question is, like, how do we use these opportunities to bring up these strategic conversations, right? And use class struggle as a laboratory, y'all, okay? So like, think about every time there's a fight that happens, that's an opportunity to test some things out. So how do you like come up with a strategy as best as you can, right, among the people who are in struggle, and then like apply that and draw the lessons like from that too. But I think it's an opportunity, and we always, maybe it comes to something, maybe it doesn't, but it's worth trying, as we're trying with not just like kind of full intentionality, whatever that word means, but because a dynamic is shifting. Because the fight to get university workers, like, you know, cafeteria workers a living wage, that wasn't always the case, right? Now that it is, now that like students on the university's campus are struck and there's like this kind of relative history, right, of fight, like how do you tap into that and extend that, right? So, you know, that's all I have to say.
Yeah, and the term militancy was brought up earlier too, you know, and I think, you know, I've heard that term used in multiple ways, but one way that I sort of think about militancy is, you know, it's not just about like being the loudest or the most vocal or like, you know, breaking shit or like whatever, you know, like I think of militancy as a long-term commitment to struggles and to, you know, developing other people into militancy, you know, and so like Tristan was saying, you know, like picking those battles, you know, that's why I tell that story about like the thermostat a lot, because it seems so minuscule, but that small win was a catalyst towards exposing workers to collective action, you know, and we can take other opportunities for, you know, addressing people who are misgendered, which is probably something that students and faculty and other people experience too, like these, you know, these widely felt issues, which might not need a full strike, you know, it might just be getting classrooms full of people wearing pronoun pins on the same day or something like that, you know, but it's, you know, it's being dedicated to the struggle. It's like being dedicated to so many other things. If you've ever taken like, you know, like a martial arts or something like that, they don't teach you how to do a jump kick on the first day. They say, put your feet apart and step forward all the way across the room. And then you take a step backward and you spend your whole day just learning how to move your feet. And that's it, you know, and I think that's kind of how we have to think about it, is taking small steps to develop people, because struggles are their learning experiences. This is how we educate people. This is how we treat people. And soon enough, you know, when those punches fly at you, you're just automatically moving your head back and forth. But that doesn't come right away. That comes from, you know, learning those beginning and intermediary steps. And that comes through those smaller struggles, those lower hanging struggles. But when we demonstrate to people effective ways of taking those on and winning, then we build up people's confidence, we build up their class consciousness, and that's how we build up those fights. We start crossing over into, you know, different departments, different sectors, but it has to start with taking on the smaller winnable fights and teaching people how to fight in the first place, and also learning ourselves how to do it. Yeah, thank you all. Craig, do you want to go?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question. I think the thing is the camera, right, Karen? We're good. Tristan, you talked about political parties, and so I want to raise the question up about how any of the speakers or folks in the room think about the relationship potentially between unions, the labor movement, workers, and potentially a new political party. Many folks in the room may not know that there was such a thing as the Labor Party in the United States in 1996. It was started, and ultimately it sort of failed, right? A couple of years later for various reasons. If you talk about the Democratic Party, Tristan, in part is sort of, some people would say, the graveyard of social movements, right? The Democratic Party is one way it's described sometimes. And I'm not trying to introduce a huge debate as much as to say, to what extent does the formation of a different kind of political party factor into any of your thinking about, you know, workers, labor, unions, et cetera? Like how might we think about that in the future? Whomever.
My impression is, at least in the context that I talked about, Wayne State University, there's not a particularly straightforward relationship between affiliation with one of the two major parties and kind of the attitude towards what was happening with organizing at the School of Medicine and, you know, attempting to stave off many of these questions of efficiency and so on. So I don't think that in any of our discussions or any of the discussions that members, the leadership in the union had, I doubt if they ever really consciously thought of whether they were appealing to Democrats or Republicans. And I think they were frequently disappointed that people who should have been more favorable towards labor organizing and labor rights turned out not to be when they were in positions of influence and power. And so I think, you know, you've heard the notion power corrupts, and, you know, regarding the more general question, I think maybe, so the United States is a highly programmed society, I think, as I observe it. I mean, I didn't grow up in the US, and of course the US has changed over time, but it's an extremely programmed society. And the hope was that the internet would change that, but actually the internet changed it for the worse, because people simply retreated into, or seem to have retreated into these comfort zones where what they were already programmed to want or to like to hear, they now seek out more and more. And there's lots of criticisms about this. So I hate to kind of sound like a downer about this, but I think that certainly at the national stage, this is a real challenge. The local stage is different. And like I said, at Wayne State, I don't personally think that the union leadership thinks in terms of Democrats, Republicans, or, you know, any other third party. They're trying to work a problem. And it can be quite surprising how people who you might expect would think in a different way simply because they have a certain affiliation tend not to think in that way when you're talking about a local problem.
Okay, a couple things. Sorry, I'm trying to move this short. One, I can't be so gracious to the trade bureaucracy because, yeah, maybe if you did the first 2 times an election happened, you could be disappointed. For like 20 years of giving millions of dollars to Democrats, No, that's more than just, misgiving and disappointment. There's a policy, but part of that policy, even if, and it's actually all the more shameful as not a explicitly thought out policy, right? Because the default always is, well, you only have limited options. And one of those limited options certainly isn't using your power as workers to like fight to represent yourself directly, right? That's the problem that we have to overcome. And I wanted just to piggyback on Graham, like talking about like the importance of like thinking of fights that you can win. I think what's really important is fighting to win, because you're not always going to win, and it actually doesn't matter that you win every struggle that you fight for. Revolutions rarely win every struggle that they were fighting for. That's in part why revolution is necessary. But if you're fighting to win, that means you're bringing all of your power to bear, and people go through the experience of seeing the limitations, not because of what they were trying to do, but because of the system, right? And they have to think about what that implies and why they have to fight for real power. And that is what we should be always thinking about from our experiences of fighting. And to that end, do people know that there's actually a Michigan working class party that actually has independent access? And I know a friend who helped set up this party, incidentally. And let's just say it didn't take a ton of resources. It took like some grit for sure, but it didn't take millions of dollars in corporate dollars for that to happen. And I say this just to say that from a pragmatic standpoint, even the idea of creating a third political party isn't always the obstacle that people make it up to be. But barring that, because in the United States, it's incredibly hard to like get a third political party. Power of the working class doesn't necessarily demand a workers' party or a workers' party that is strictly electoral. We need a political party, in truth, as workers and oppressed people. The type of party we need has to be a combat party that uses elections when we can, but understands that in the end, our power is based on, right, our strategic position as people who make the society run, right? And how to use that power that we have, which strikes are one of the main ways for that power to be expressed, withholding our labor, right? And challenging the system directly, right? Like creating disruptions, which is also what mass protests do, right? Or can do, like school occupations can do. Like how do we like think about that in those terms of changing the power? And that, like you can have a revolution whether or not you have an electoral workers' party or not. We do need a political party. But again, not the type of party that we often think of. And I also say that because I think pragmatism is so terrible. It is the American ideology, and it leads us so often to so many terrible things. The last thing I'll say is just this highly programmed society is programmed because it is a society based on imperialism, where we get to benefit a whole lot of things because of the extraction that this country is part of in stealing the resources of the rest of the world. And so we also have to think about that and think about connecting with those struggles of other oppressed people, because that's part of fighting the program, is fighting and recognizing the proceeds of our privilege coming from the backs of oppressed people around the world. And we have to say something about that in the knowledge chat. So.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have a clear-cut answer as to whether or not we need a party or don't. I would say though, a lot of times the proposition of a party, it comes out of feelings of powerlessness, or that that we're at like some sort of like crossroads where we can't do something. I mean, if you look at like the wave of Starbucks elections, for example, right now, they've been filing all of these labor board elections at hundreds of stores across the United States. And now there's a bottleneck happening at the Labor Relations Board. And so all of these elections are being backed up. The company is responding with, captive audience meetings and stuff like that. And so the Democratic Party is swooping down and saying, look, you need us because, we can make these elections happen faster. We can get rid of these captive audience meetings. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we need them. We've just encountered an obstacle that we need to strategize around and overcome. And nonprofits, do this same sort of thing too. The same thing with, talking about bigger picture issues, having those, political debates about bigger issues. I don't necessarily think that we need to be running elections to solve those sort of things. I think, it's going to take some creativity. I think those conversations need to happen, but I think a lot of times people propose political parties because we end up at some sort of crossroads. I don't really think that we're unleashing our creativity as much as we could to work around those things. I think we're looking for, for legislative solutions to things or to get the right person in office. But I have more faith in the potential power of the working class that I don't think that we're really at that juncture.
Yeah, thank you all. So I'd like to start to come to a close. So if each of you in 1 minute could just say a takeaway, whether that's something that you learned from each other or something that the students or the public should take away from this conversation, whether they should take that back to their campuses as students or to their jobs as service workers, or their places within society and within this world. So we can start with Dave, and just in a minute, one takeaway.
Well, I think somebody asked the question about organization and militancy, and militancy is a loaded word, but I would say that a precursor to organization and action is knowledge. And I think that, given the pros and cons of the very free dissemination of information, I think you are in a position to really benefit from the pros. And for example, all of you work in a public university. In principle, the financial records of your university are public. You have the ability to know how much your administrators make. You have the ability to ask, why do they make what they make? Do they deserve to make what they make? You have the ability to reason for yourselves, what is the financial compensation that they're getting? How much does that impact you in terms of the tuition that you pay to the public university that you go to? And so I think you really live in a time of enormous opportunity to know about the world around you. And what I would say to you is take advantage of that opportunity, because it's a cliche, but you will never be at this stage of your life again when you have a relatively low level of personal responsibilities and therefore have enormous time to devote to social or to thinking about social responsibilities.
So my takeaway is that I want to leave with folks is that the way we've been talking about power and the power that we have collectively, and even the power to take power, right? Take control. That act of taking power has to be a fully conscious and organized act. It is not going to happen spontaneously, nor is the creation of a perspective that can allow us to do that. That's why organization is important, because actually it's our ability to tap into our creativity as individuals and to test our theories out with each other. And to me, that is why political organization is absolutely necessary. And that's why, again, I think of political party completely different than the one that we have, but that's necessary. Organization is necessary. It's necessary because it's the way to organize the discussions that we need and to test out the strategies that are the byproduct of that. And so with that, I definitely want to invite people to connect with me, look up Left Ways, look up Detroit Will Breathe, I really would, for anyone who's interested in getting more involved or to be a part of a process, right, where we can have more organized discussions about strategies and politics, I definitely would love to facilitate and be a part of that. So like bug me, I would give my number out, but I won't because of this. But if you want my number and email, like totally grab it from me like after this.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I want to say I've been really wrapping my brain about being here all day today. Like I've been, for the past week, like pacing around my apartment, trying to figure out, what am I going to say? What am I going to do? But being up front here, with these two panelists, really gave me a boost of confidence. And I think, it just really helped me feel like motivated and focused. And, I think like that's a really good metaphor, I think, for just how I approach a lot of these things. Like you never know what sort of inspiration you're going to be, and if you surround yourself with people who are going to push you to go to the next level and push you out of your comfort zone too, that's the sort of that's where it starts, and that's what gets us to these next levels. And I mean, I've just by asking people to do simple stuff in organizing, I've had people come up and thank me just for coming to a meeting or whatever. So yeah, I mean, I think again, just making sure that we're setting the pace to where we're pushing people out of our comfort zones. I think like that's where it starts. Don't be afraid to push the envelope with your coworkers, with your fellow students.
Thank you all so much. You've been informative, inspiring, and I hope that everyone in the audience on YouTube, Zoom, in person, takes something away from this conversation. I'm fired up, and I hope everyone else is. So thank you so much.
Appreciate you.
And thank you again, speakers and everybody, for your comments. I'm Craig, one of the people organizing this series. Next week, quick preview, next week is globalization and the logistics of workers' power. We're going to have people here, Abiyomi Azikwe, who is a Pan-African Newswire editor, as well as a longtime activist in Detroit. Vicente Duran from Garaje Cultural in Southwest Detroit, who's Chilean, who lives in Southwest Detroit and has for a long time. And a person whose name I'm forgetting, who is involved with Amazonians United, which is folks organizing Amazon workers. The person coming not from Detroit, but will be zooming in with our super high-tech camera, which, by the way, it sort of follows speakers around. That's why we had to move the speaker up here. In any case,